Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today's story is an unusual one. It is about two brothers, born 17 months apart, who would both go on to become serial killers. Whilst it is not particularly unusual for criminals to stem from the same family, what is interesting about this case is that the two men became killers completely independently of each other and had completely different motives and victims. Whilst it is clear that not all abused children become serial killers, nor all serial killers have been victims of childhood abuse, as so often is the case in these crimes, we look at the childhood of the perpetrators and find that it was marred by instability and abuse. For Dany and Larry Rains, this was certainly true. Dany was born on the 20th of October 1943, and 17 months later, on the 22nd of March 1945, Larry was born. The boys had an older and younger sister, and all four of the siblings suffered substantial abuse at the hands of their father. He was a violent alcoholic who became particularly mean when drunk. He would lash out at whoever was close by, and his children were often on the receiving end of his violent temper. Their father would make them drink whiskey and fight for small change, which he would throw on the floor, only allowing them to stop once just one of them was left standing or one had broken down into tears, therefore meaning that they had lost by default. When Dany was 10 and Larry was 9 years old, their father left the family. He moved to Florida, where he took a job in a service station and never saw them again. However, it would seem that by this point, violence was instilled in the two boys, and whilst they were close at times, they would often violently argue. Years later, Larry would say how some of their arguments escalated to the point of them throwing knives or attempting to shoot each other with bows and arrows. In 1958, at the age of 13, Larry met a 23-year-old mother of three named Sue. Over the following years, he spent increasing amounts of time with her, helping to raise her young children, before eventually becoming intimately involved with her. Around the same time, both Larry and Dany began dating one of their high school friends, Kathy. By the age of 16, Larry dropped out of school and became ever more the troublemaker. At the age of 17, he and a friend stole a car, but were quickly arrested. The district attorney agreed to nullify Larry's sentence if he enlisted in the army. However, his time in the military was problematic from the start, as he repeatedly had to be disciplined for misconduct and chronic alcoholism, and spent the majority of his time in military prison before being discharged. Meanwhile, during this time, Dany had married Kathy, the girl who both brothers had been dating, and the pair went on to have 3 children together. When Larry returned to Kalamazoo after his stint in the army, he repeatedly begged Sue to marry him. However, she refused every time. He became increasingly depressed and attempted to take his own life. He was saved by a police officer and spent 10 days at the Kalamazoo Regional Psychiatric Hospital before being discharged. By the age of 19, Larry would often hitchhike to various places in the US. He had been doing so for around 3 months when, on the evening of 29th of May 1964, Larry was offered a lift by a man by the name of Gary Smock. Gary was a 30-year-old junior high school teacher who had been at a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was passing through Kalamazoo as he was heading to a family dinner. His wife, Thelma, was waiting for him at their home with their 2 children, 4-year-old Cynthia and Deanna, who was just 6 months old. Gary's kind gesture towards Larry would end up costing him his life. After Gary stopped to give him a lift, Larry forced Gary to drive onto a country road and robbed him of just $3. He told Gary to get into the boot of his car and to be quiet. However, Gary started kicking and thumping to make himself heard. Larry stopped on a quiet road just outside of Kalamazoo. He opened the boot of the car and fired his .22 caliber gun twice. The first bullet missed, but the second hit Gary in the head, just below the ear. An autopsy would later conclude that Gary would have died from the gunshot wound within a couple of minutes. Leaving Gary's body in the boot of the car, Larry went and bought himself a burger before driving Gary's car to Elkhart in Indiana, which was approximately 60 miles away. Here in the early hours of the 30th of May, he robbed the gas station where he shot the attendant, Charles Snyder, twice in the head and made off with $100. Charles's body was found by a group of fishermen quite soon after the murder had taken place. The police were informed and roadblocks set up around the area. As Larry tried to return to Kalamazoo, he approached one of these roadblocks. He was driving Gary's car, with Gary's body still in the boot of the vehicle. He was stopped at the roadblock and questioned. He acted relaxed and was waved through without any suspicion. Larry then returned to the place where he had killed Gary, stole his shoes and watch, and abandoned the car. Larry knew that there was blood on the bumper and potential evidence in the vehicle, but he did not want to hang around to clean this up. Apparently, by this point, he simply did not care. At the same time, Gary's wife, Thelma Smock, was at the local police station making a missing persons report. Gary had called her the previous evening to say that he was running late for dinner, but had never returned home. Hearing the patrol officer report details of the abandoned car, Thelma said that it matched the description of the one that her husband drove. Once the boot of the car was opened, any hope that Gary was still a missing person disappeared. The police were able to take a fingerprint and a palm print from the car. It was determined that they did not match either Gary or his family, and it was hoped that they would eventually provide a match to Gary's killer. The authorities in Indiana and Michigan collaborated with information about Gary and Charles' murders to establish if they were indeed linked. In less than a week, they would have their answer. Larry went to visit Sue and confessed to her what he had done. She became hysterical and called her mother and a friend. The police were notified, and Larry waited patiently for them to arrive and arrest him. At the time of his arrest, he was wearing Gary's watch and shoes. When asked about the crimes, he readily admitted killing both men and handed over the murder weapon. Larry was appointed a public defender, Eugene Field, and sent for psychiatric evaluation. As the investigation continued, links were made to other open cases. On April the 6th that year, another service station attendant was murdered. 20-year-old Vernon LeBen was shot dead with a .22 caliber gun in Battle Creek, near where Gary had been driving on the night when he stopped to help Larry. Vernon had been due to get married the following day. When questioned about this crime, Larry admitted that he was the one who had killed Vernon. Larry then added 2 more crimes in 2 other states to the growing list. He told the police that a man had picked him up when he was hitchhiking near Death Valley on the 23rd of May. This man kept talking about how he had no money, and so realising he was of no use to him, Larry shot him dead. This man's body remained missing for over 2 years. Larry also confessed to killing another service station attendant, this time in Kentucky. Larry would later state that he had planned to end his life after each murder, but had never been able to. He believed that after his arrest he would be sentenced to death, as he did not want to live either as a free man or incarcerated. Larry was only prosecuted for Gary's murder, with the other charges left in reserve pending the results of that trial, which started at Kalamazoo County Circuit Court in September 1964. His defense attorney, Eugene Field, stated that Larry was not guilty by reason of insanity and produced several psychologists to support this. These psychologists testified that Larry had committed the murder during a period of temporary insanity that had occurred due to the rage he experienced against his father, who had beat him throughout his early life. However, the jury found Larry guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Larry appealed his conviction on the basis that the prosecutor's psychiatrists had started to examine him before his lawyer was present. He was successful and won the right to a new trial in 1971. However, it soon became clear that his insanity defence was weak, and as such he pled guilty and received a new life sentence. As a concession for his guilty plea, he was allowed to change his name to Monk Steppenwolf, which was named after the protagonist in the 1927 novel by Hermann Hesse. Whilst Larry's murderous rampage was taking place in 1964, his older brother Dany was living with his wife Kathy and their young children. However, as the years progressed, their relationship had become increasingly volatile and violent. On the 26th of November 1968, armed with a gun, Dany attacked a 17-year-old woman by the name of Dorothy King. As Dorothy left from her job at the Coveys drugstore at around 7 p.m. that evening, Dany approached her and abducted Dorothy in her own car. He headed to the outskirts of town, but when he made a wrong turn and attempted to turn the car around, Dorothy was able to escape and ran screaming for help. Dany threw away the gun and ran off. However, when he returned to collect his own car from the scene of the abduction, he was arrested. The following year, Dany was found guilty of assaulting Dorothy and was sentenced to 3 to 4 years in prison. During this time, Kathy divorced him. Dany was paroled in 1972, after which he returned to Kalamazoo and got a job working at a petrol station. During this time, 29-year-old Dany met and befriended a 15-year-old by the name of Brent Costa. Brent had also had a troubled upbringing. His mother had schizophrenia and his father was an alcoholic. Brent was homeless when he met Dany, and soon the older man was helping him, finding him somewhere to sleep and helping Brent to get a job. As the trust between the pair grew, Dany told Brent about a crime that he had committed 3 months earlier. In March of that year, 29-year-old Patricia Houck went to do some shopping, taking her 17-month-old son Corey with her. She never returned home. Her husband reported her missing, and the following day a lady found young Corey wandering aimlessly with blood on him. She took the boy to the police station and they began a search for Patricia. Her body was soon located behind the nearby Independent Elevator Company building. Brent would later describe how Dany had bragged about committing the crime. Dany claimed that he saw Patricia going into Top's department store, so he parked his van next to her car and waited. After about an hour, she came out and settled her son into the passenger seat of her vehicle. As Patricia walked around to get into the driver's side, Dany got out of his blue Corvair van and pulled out a knife. He forced Patricia into his van, where he tied her up and then sexually assaulted her. He attempted to strangle her, but Patricia put up a fight, scratching his face. During the violent struggle, they fell out of the van. Dany then stabbed her in the back, but claimed that it didn't seem to have much effect, so he twisted the knife to cause further harm. By this point, young Corey had got out of the car and was stood next to the van crying. At just 17 months old, Dany assumed that the boy would not be able to recall anything, so left him alone. Brent went on to say that Dany had told him that what he did worked so well that they should do another attack together, grab a woman, sexually assault her, rob her, and then kill her. Brent agreed. The pair put together a kit containing knives, rubbish bags, and ropes. They then went looking for victims. On July the 5th, 1972, Dany was working at the service station on Sprinkle Road in Kalamazoo when 2 young women pulled in at around 1:30 a.m. to fill their car up with petrol. Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup, who were both 19 years old, were roommates who were travelling from Chicago to meet up with Linda's brother in Ann Arbor. Brent filled the car with petrol as Dany looked under the bonnet. Dany disconnected one of the spark plugs in order to make the car seem as though it had a problem. He asked the women to pull into a parking bay so that he could have a closer look and fix it for them. The 2 men then pulled out knives, telling the women not to scream and they would not be hurt. Dany instructed Linda and Claudia to get in the back seat of the car and then drove it around the back of the service station where the lights were off. The 2 men then tied the women up, with one keeping watch, whilst the other continued to serve customers. Both Dany and Brent repeatedly sexually assaulted the two women before Dany told Brent that it was time for him to kill Claudia in order for him to taste the medicine. Brent tried to strangle Claudia with a rope, but she fought for her life. In the end, Dany assisted Brent and they killed Claudia together. Brent then strangled Linda. The women's bodies were put on the back seat of their car, covered with a blanket, and then Brent drove the car to a wooded area near Galesburg. He covered it with petrol, lit a cigarette and threw it onto the floor of the car before walking away. He hiked back to the garage where Dany showed him what he had taken from the women: 2 rings, some money, some earrings and photographs. 12 days later, some bikers came across the abandoned car. The cigarette had failed to light the accelerant, and the girls' decomposing bodies could still be seen on the back seat of the vehicle. Due to the level of decomposition, the exact cause of death could not be 100% verified, but the ropes around their necks indicated that they were strangled at some point. It was also impossible to determine whether they had been sexually assaulted from the conditions of their remains. The police felt that these murders could be linked to that of Patricia Houck, due to the similarities in the way in which the women had been bound and killed, but they were still a long way off from catching Dany and Brent. A month after the pair murdered Linda and Claudia, they struck again. On August the 5th of 1972, they kidnapped 18-year-old Pamela Fearnow. Pamela had been hitchhiking on the Western Michigan University campus when they spotted her. Threatening her at knife point, they forced her into their van, where they tied her up, covered her with a sleeping bag, and drove to a secluded, wooded area. For over 6 hours, the pair sexually abused her before taking her to a different area near a lake. Brent then claimed that he and Dany began drinking beer and gave Pamela some wine. They then moved locations for a 3rd time, and when Pamela started to scream for help, Dany punched her in the stomach. When this failed to subdue her, Brent put a plastic bag over her head and suffocated her. They then moved Pamela's body away from the van. Soon after, Dany spotted a police car and Brent ran away. The police stopped, checked Dany's ID and said that he was free to leave. The following day, the pair returned and moved Pamela's body to a more secluded area. Not long after this, the friendship between Dany and Brent began to break down, and the police were getting closer to solving the crimes. On September the 4th, Dany was brought in for questioning about the murders of Linda and Claudia in July. When the police had been looking into service stations near to where the girl's car had been found, they uncovered Dany's criminal record for the failed abduction of Dorothy King. It was also established that Brent would often be seen hanging around the service station with Dany, and he too was brought in for questioning. Brent's assigned attorney, James Hills, told him that if he cooperated, he would be allowed to plead to only 1 case of second-degree murder, so Brent told the police his version of events. On October the 18th, Brent led the police to Pamela's body, who had been a missing person since her disappearance over 2 months earlier. She had been left less than a mile from where the bodies of Linda and Claudia had been discovered. Brent claimed that Dany had always been the main instigator of the crimes and that he had ended their friendship as he feared that Dany would kill him as well. Brent also told the police about how Dany had told him all about murdering Patricia Houck, which had occurred before the pair met. Brent was still only 15 years old, and as such his attorney wanted to keep his case in juvenile court. However, Donald Burge, the then Kalamazoo County prosecutor, wanted it moved to adult court in view of the particularly brutal nature of the crimes. Dany claimed that he was innocent of all charges and that he was not a killer. Nevertheless, he ended up in a maximum security cell in the same county jail where his brother Larry was awaiting his retrial for the murder of Gary Smock. They were housed in cells number 1 and 2. Whilst Larry changed his plea to guilty, Dany continued to protest his innocence. He went to trial in February 1973 for the murder of Patricia Houck. Even though Brent had not known Dany at the time of the murder, he was the main witness against him. He testified as to how Dany had recited the whole incident to him, with the testimony matching the physical evidence from the crime scene. Another witness was Kathy Rains, Dany's ex-wife, who said that a few days after Patricia's murder, she had noticed a scratch on Dany's face. He claimed that it had happened when he was doing some DIY. Dany's mother also suspected that he may have been involved in Patricia's murder, but Dany's attorney attempted to undermine her credibility by stating that she had been under the care of a psychiatrist and had been smoking pot at that time. It also came to light that in the month before the trial started, a prison guard had found a torn-up note in the toilet of Dany's cell. This note indicated that he was trying to find a woman who was prepared to lie to the police to give him an alibi for the night of Patricia's murder. With the compelling evidence against him, Dany was convicted and he received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for second-degree murder and the other for murder in the perpetration of a sexual assault. Dany went to trial for a second time in July 1973, this time for the murder of Pamela Fearnow. Once again, the key witness against Dany was Brent. Brent again gave details of what had happened to Pamela, which matched the physical evidence that the police had gathered. Dany was again found guilty and given another life sentence. He was then due to face a trial for the murders of Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup. In this case, there was strong physical evidence against him, rather than just relying on the testimony of Brent, and as such, Dany pleaded no contest to reduce charges of second-degree murder. He received 2 more life sentences. As part of his deal, Brent pled no contest to the second-degree murder of one of the girls from Chicago, and on July 25, 1973, the judge sentenced him to life in prison with the recommendation that he would never be paroled, adding that Brent's crimes were the type of crimes that give ammunition to those who wish to restore the death penalty. However, as the lack of parole was just a recommendation, there would be a built-in parole consideration after 10 years. Brent maintained that as he was just 15 years old at the time of the crimes, it was easier for the older Dany to manipulate him, but he could not offer any explanation as to why he had allowed himself to be talked into such horrific crimes. Had Dany been the one who had pushed Brent to commit such depraved crimes, or were they equally responsible? Dany used his time in prison to educate himself on the law. He successfully argued that receiving 2 convictions in the case of Patricia Houck amounted to double jeopardy, and as a result, in 1979, Judge Donald Anderson cancelled the second-degree murder conviction, removing one of Dany's 5 life sentences. Dany continued to fight. In 1981, the Supreme Court set aside the second conviction for Patricia's murder on the basis that the trial judge had not told the jurors that they could consider a second-degree murder verdict as a possible charge for the murder whilst perpetrating a sexual assault conviction. This meant that the prosecution had 2 options: retry him on the same count or give him a sentence of second-degree murder. They did the latter and opted for the second-degree murder conviction. Second-degree murder allows for the possibility of parole. Dany had also received second-degree murder convictions when he pleaded no contest to the murders of Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup, which meant that it was only the conviction for the murder of Pamela Fearnow which meant that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. Dany continued to claim that whilst he had been involved with the attack on Pamela, he had not killed her, and some believe that the police were far too quick to believe the version of events presented to them by Brent, who was obviously cooperating in order to protect himself. During their time in prison, both Larry and Dany were held in various prisons across the state of Michigan, but were kept separated and never saw each other again. Larry maintained contact with Dany's ex-wife Kathy, and the pair married on the 22nd of March 1976. However, they divorced a few years later. Larry married for a second time in 1980. According to Larry, during his time in prison, he had 4 affairs with 4 different women, 2 of which he began whilst in prison. Despite his attempts to appeal his sentences so that he would be eligible for parole, Dany died in Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan, on the 29th of January 2022 at the age of 78. The following year, Larry died at the Saginaw Correctional Facility in Michigan. He was also 78 at the time of his death. During his time in prison, Dany's accomplice, Brent, underwent many sex offender rehabilitation programs and earned himself a law degree. He was described by prison officials as an exemplary prisoner. However, his parole applications were consistently denied. Then, in September 2020, his application for parole was approved after taking into account his remorse for his crimes, his age when they were committed, and also his prison behaviour. It was determined by the parole board that he was unlikely to reoffend, and after spending 48 years in prison, Brent was released in January 2021. At the parole hearing, he said that he wanted a chance to contribute to society as a free man, adding that, "If I had not met Dany Rains, I know in my heart that I would never become involved in crimes like this." However, the Kalamazoo County prosecuting attorney, Jeff Getting, said in a statement that he was very troubled by the Michigan Department of Corrections decision, adding that, "In my opinion, the risks to our community is simply unacceptable. I'm not aware of another person with such a horrific history having ever been released anywhere." Larry and Dany were relatively unique in that they independently became serial killers with different timelines, MOs, and victim types. And for these 2 men in particular, the line between nature and nurture is extremely blurred. From my research, I cannot find any information about their sisters' lives, so I assume that they lived a life without any major criminal offences, even though they were subjected to the same upbringing. The fact that Larry's victims resembled their father, who violently abused them growing up, and 2 of his victims worked at a service station, as did their father, would point towards Larry holding a lot of rage towards their dad. On the other hand, Dany's crimes were sexually motivated, and all of his victims were women. The 2 brothers often had to compete in front of their alcoholic father, who encouraged aggressive rivalry between the pair, and had also competed for the attention of Kathy, who they both ended up marrying. Did the publicity that Larry received during his trial and appeal at the same time that Dany and Kathy split up trigger something inside of Dany that started his series of murders? Whilst it would be a massive leap to suggest that the extensive crimes that these 2 men committed can be wholly attributed to their dire upbringing, we will never know just how much of an effect that upbringing had. Had they been born into a stable, loving family, would they still have ended up the monsters that they became, or could a regular upbringing have prevented them spiralling into a life of crime? Whilst it is widely agreed that both nature and nurture play a part in making people into who they are, the extent of the importance of each can never be fully known. It is a fascinating subject, and as always, I would love to hear your opinions and views in the comments section below. That concludes today's story. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The Kalamazoo Railroad and Car Company was founded in 1883. They made railroad speeders to travel along the tracks. They had an air-cooled engine that produced 16 brake horsepower. How times have changed. Goodbye.